Hello to all viewers. My name is Goryoun Koyounian. I'm a senior correspondent for Horizon Weekly, and I'm thrilled to welcome today Professor Benny Morris to this Zoom interview. Professor Morris is a renowned scholar of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and a renowned historian from the David Ben-Gurion University at the Middle East Studies Institute. And he's also the co-author alongside fellow historian from the David Ben-Gurion University, Dror Ze'evi, of the voluminous 672-page book, The 30-Year Genocide, Turkey's Destruction of its Christian Minorities, 1894 to 1924. Professor Benny Morris, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So you're obviously very well known for your prior influential works on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you've written an influential book on the Israeli-Arab War of 1948. I was curious, first of all, how you came to transition to shift your focus to this particular topic. What made that transition for you?
Just curiosity. I've published a number of books on the Israeli-Arab conflict, I think 8 or 9, and I've become bored with the subject, and I don't think I can innovate much any longer on that, or I don't want to. So I looked around for another subject, and the subject of the Armenian genocide of 1915, 1916. I don't know what this is doing. The Armenian the Armenian genocide of 1915-16 attracted my attention. The subject itself is very interesting, and also because it's controversial in the sense that there are two schools of thought about what happened. One which is more or less accepted in the West, no, not completely, and another which is promoted by Turkey. And I was interested in looking at the documentation and seeing what actually happened, which is why I approached my colleague Dror Ze'evi, who's an actual Ottomanist, which I'm not, and we then decided to work together on the subject.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that captured my attention immediately was the very title of the book, 30-Year Genocide, the Turkey's Destruction of its Christian Minorities, 1894 to 1924. Right away, you seem to be announcing the very major arguments, which will then be reiterated in greater detail in the book.
Well,
yeah.
Well, as I said, initially, what triggered my interest was what happened in 1915, 1916 to the Armenians. But then we both saw, looking at the documentation, that really the subject wasn't the Armenian genocide of 1915, 1916, but it was what had happened to the Armenians starting more or less in 1894 and ending, in fact, in 1924, when the last Armenians were expelled from Asia Minor or killed. And it was wider than this in the sense that it encompassed also the Greek and the Assyrian Christian communities, again, during that 30-year period. So what we ended up seeing was from the documentation that really it was the subject was really the de-Christianization of Turkey rather than the de-Armenization of Turkey. De-Christianization over a 30-year period, much of it done by murder, but also by expulsion as well.
Yeah, and that's certainly one of the major arguments in the book, and I will try to delve into that a bit later. First off, I was curious also about why the choice of 1894 and why you decide to choose that as the clear demarcation point beyond which the fate of Ottoman Christians changes drastically. What is the historical shift there?
Yeah, well, it's true that Christians on and off over the decades had been persecuted before by the Ottoman state. There had even been massacres, small-scale massacres in various places before 1894. And there was continuous oppression, especially of the Armenians in the eastern provinces of Asia Minor before 1894. But 1894 marked a change in that year began a series of massacres which ended at the beginning of 1896, in which something between 100 and 300,000 Armenians, mainly Armenians, there were some Assyrians as well, and maybe a few Greeks, but mainly Armenians were massacred. In other words, 100,000 were actually physically murdered in several bouts of slaughter, especially in big towns in the eastern provinces. And another 100 or 200,000 died as a result of the slaughter, mainly of males, during these massacres. So this marked a qualitative change in what was happening in Turkey. And this, I think, stemmed from Abdul-Hamid's hostility towards the Christians in his empire, especially in Asia Minor, and probably in a desire to be rid of the Armenians and perhaps even all the Christians. But he actually spoke initially of the Armenians as the enemy.
Mm-hmm. And this broad historical trend of de-Christianizing the Ottoman Empire you describe as a 30-year-long period. And in the introduction, I found it interesting that you acknowledged actually how this broader view of genocide conflicts with some of the more mainstream interpretations of the genocide. And could you explain, first of all, what this mainstream view of the genocide is and how you conflict with it? What are the odds there?
Well, we're talking about the murder of between 1.5 and 2.5 million Christians, of whom at least 1 million and perhaps 1.5 million were Armenians. And previous historians and good historians, Ronald Sunni, Donald Bloxham, Taner Akçam, have written well about the destruction of the Armenians, focusing mainly on 1915, 1916. They gave a bit of attention to 1894-96, which was in a sense sort of a preview. They almost devoted no space at all to what happened to the Armenians after World War I during 1919, 1924 under Ataturk's regime. So we sort of saw that other historians who'd written good works but had limited their scope, both in terms of the ethnic group, Armenians, and in terms of the chronology, which should be taken in the earlier period and the later period must be taken into account, even to understand what happened in 1915, 1916, in our view.
Now, in mentioning in pointing out this broad contiguity between the 1890s and the 1920s, you also acknowledge that there are some political orientation differences between the different regimes, of course, and of course how the Kurdish question is treated evolves over time as Turkey assumes an exclusive ethno-nationalist identity in the 1920s. How much is that relevant in terms of drawing out a broader pattern of contiguity? In terms of do you think like mainstream scholars might have a point in saying there is a fundamental distinction between the Hamidian era and the Kemalist era, or how large?
No, I don't. There is a difference, and I don't think it's the fundamental difference. Okay. During the Hamidian era, imperial and Islamist thinking and ideology were prominent in the massacres, without doubt. That is, they were a prominent reason. And starting somehow at the beginning of the 20th century, nationalism, the Turkification of the country, begins to take precedence. And this is certainly true during 1919, 1924 under Ataturk. But throughout the period, 1894, 1924, is Islamic thought and Islamic ideology, the idea of jihad against the infidel, uprooting the infidel who is the enemy of Islam and a threat to Islam, is true. In other words, it doesn't shift simply from Islamic thinking and imperial thinking, and the Armenians say as a danger to the empire. It doesn't just shift to Turkifying Turkey under Ataturk. These things happen, but at the same time, throughout the period, you've also got the Muslim base, that is the sense, and Ataturk was supposedly a secular man, also exploited this Islamic sentiment, Islamic passions in mobilizing his people to murder Armenians, to murder Greeks, and to murder Assyrians. So this Islamic sentiment is continuous as a basic cause of the mass murder.
Mm-hmm. And the way you approach this this religious dimension of the genocide is certainly a novelty when contrasted with some mainstream traditional interpretations. And another way in which this religious dimension.
Let me add to this. You've raised the subject. We didn't arrive at our conclusion with a preconception, but when we looked at the documents, we saw that not only the Westerners looking at Turkey, those living in Turkey, looking at what the Turks were doing and saying, yes, Islam is at the base of these massacres, is the main driving force in this massacre, but the Muslims themselves were saying as much. They in 1914, they declared jihad at the head of the mobs who slaughter Christians in Istanbul in 1895. There are prominent among them in the mob, leading the mobs, are Muslim clerics and softas, seminarians. And the same applies throughout Turkey, throughout this period, 1894, 1923, 24, when it isn't the army doing it, when it's the civilians who are actually carrying out the murders. And this actually happens in many of the places. It's not so much the army as the neighbors, the citizenry, the Muslim citizens who are carrying out the murders. We throughout see muftis often in charge of the mobs or leading the mobs or egging on the mobs. Occasionally you also find a mufti or a Muslim religious cleric who is against what's happening, but this is very rare. Normally they're in the vanguard of the massacres. And these preachers sent even deliberately around the countryside by Ataturk and others, a man like Sanusi, who comes from Libya and ends up in Turkey, and he moves from town to town preaching Allah's word and the need to declare jihad and slaughter the infidel. So the religious sentiment is there throughout. And it's not just Westerners saying it, but it's actually Muslims doing and even saying it themselves.
Mm-hmm. And another way in which you try to draw a contrast is as you mentioned earlier in the interview, that so many works try to treat genocide in isolation, as treating each group's experiences separately, as opposed to a broader, more contiguous view. And I was curious how you came about that reasoning and why that choice.
Well, look, we looked at what Ataturk was saying and doing, and as I said, Ataturk was supposedly a secular man. Certainly he was prominently in the European mind, a Europeanizer and a secular Europeanizer when it came to Turkey. That's how he was conceived. That's how he was seen.
Mm-hmm.
But he's at this time also talking about the Christians when he comes to Smyrna in September 1922, after they conquered Smyrna, Izmir in today's Turkey, and they begin to slaughter Armenians in the town, and then begin to slaughter Greeks, and then expel the remaining Greeks. He tells Western diplomats there, we must de-Christianize Turkey. We must throw out the Christians. He doesn't say Armenians. He doesn't even say Greeks, against whom he's been fighting for the previous 3 years. But he said, there's no room for Christians anymore in this country. He says it very bluntly. He says Christians. He keeps saying Christians, not Greeks, not Armenians, but Christians. And the same applies also in 1915, 16. While they are busy massacring almost exclusively the Armenians, there is continuous reference also to getting rid of the Christians. Talat himself talks about this is our opportunity to rid Turkey of this Christian problem. Doesn't say Armenian problem. He does occasionally also say Armenian, but he also uses the phrase the Christians. They are the problem.
And you seem to come back to so many references, and readers will certainly note how much references there are in this book, from Christian missionary reports to European diplomatic cables and Turkish governmental sources, Armenian sources, and so forth. Yet you also talk in the introduction a bit about how some military archives in Turkey still remain inaccessible to some researchers. And also you delve into how some of the documentation has been purged from incriminating references to some of the mass killings. So in light of that, I was curious, in your view, how much is there yet to be uncovered in this genocide scholarship? How much do we not yet know?
That's a good question. Well, firstly, about the facts about the archives, it's fairly clear, not 100% clear, but 99% clear, that successive Turkish governments have purged the main Turkish archive, which is the Prime Minister's Office archive in Istanbul, and have purged regional, provincial archives as well of what you said, what you called incriminating material, material which says Turks ordered the massacres and then carried them out and committed massacres. This doesn't exist at all in Turkish archives, those which I mentioned, which is a bit strange because the Turks themselves admit that there were massacres. Today they say there were massacres, but the Armenians triggered them. It's the Armenians' fault. It was really like a civil war. The Turks massacred Armenians, Armenians massacred Turks. That's the way they present it. But once you present it that way, then you should be able to say, well, these documents show this, but they don't have documents about massacres because these have been purged. The second problem is the military archive, which especially is important in relation to what the Turks call their war of independence under Ataturk, the war between Ataturk and the Greeks, the French, even the Russians in the east of Turkey during 1919-1923. And the documentation for that war, which included mass murder and mass expulsions of Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks, that documentation is totally closed to researchers. Perhaps they allow some researchers who work for the defense ministry in Turkey to look at them, but normal objective researchers in Turkey and from outside are not allowed access to the military archive. It's essentially closed to researchers, except doing what the court wants, the regime wants.
Yes.
So that's a major problem. But on the other hand, as you point out, we did use a lot of archival material. That is, the book is, I think it has something like 7,000 footnotes, which refer to documents from 1894-1924. So we saw hundreds of thousands, literally, of German, Austro-Hungarian, British, American, French documentation, all of which is essentially the same. In Germany and Austria were on Turkey's side during World War I, but the German consuls and German businessmen and German missionaries who were in Turkey reported exactly what the Western anti-Turkish diplomats, consuls from England and America and missionaries from America and Canada, etc., reported. It's exactly the same story. Expulsions, murder, mass forced conversion, massive rape of women, abduction of women and children in their tens of thousands to Muslim homes. All of this appears in the German and Austrian documentation, exactly the same as in the documentation of the Western democracies which opposed Turkey during World War I.
Mm-hmm. And finally, in light of this immense documentation and amount of archives that are available that show a clear genocidal trend throughout these 30 years, what do you make, first of all, what was the reception like? Was there any sort of reception in Turkish society? And finally, do you see any progressive change happening in Turkish society in terms of coming to acknowledging the genocide?
Dror Ze'evi, as I said, is an Ottoman, is my co-author, and he dealt more with Turkey. But so far as we've been able to make out, we have heard almost nothing from Turkey about the book. In other words, I think academics have read the book. They probably get copies via Amazon, or they bring them in when they come to Turkey. But I don't think they are able to react certainly favorably towards the book in public, because they will be punished. Turkey is a semi-dictatorship, if not a full dictatorship, certainly when it comes to academic work and work about Turkey's past. So we haven't seen almost any Turkish reviews, for example, of the book. We have seen reviews of the book in the West by scholars. Some of them were very negative. Some of them essentially took up the Turkish narrative that it was everybody else's fault, not the Turks, or everybody was equally to blame, the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Turks. Even one or two of them said there was no genocide. There was a civil war between Turks and Armenians, Turks and Greeks, etc. And therefore you can't really blame Turkey. I've been certainly, I think even Dror also, we've both been surprised by a number of such reviews appearing in the West from people who should know better, because the archives are so clear, the documentation is so clear about what happened that it really is incontrovertible. What is true is that nobody has ever found the document, but again, if there was such a document, the Turks have hidden it. One has not seen a document by Talat or Enver or Jamal, or the three of them, saying murder all the Armenians. There is no such order or document, as incidentally there is no such document for the Holocaust, Hitler ordering his people, the SS or whatever, murder all the Jews. Doesn't mean that the Holocaust didn't happen. The Holocaust certainly happened. It was Hitler who ordered it, and the same applies here to Talat and to Ataturk, and to some extent also to Abdul-Hamid. It comes from the top. It's clear from the documentation that everything stems from the top. Locals didn't do things in defiance of what the Sultan wanted. In other words, they were doing the Sultan's will, and they were doing the CUP's will, and they were doing Ataturk's will. This is how Turkey operated. People didn't go around murdering thousands of people without being sure that they had the authorization of the leadership in Istanbul.
Mm-hmm.
Or Ankara.
Yeah, and certainly your book goes through a long length of further establishing all of these facts together. So finally, I would just like to thank you, Professor Benny Morris, so much for agreeing to this interview and for taking your time. Certainly we at Horizon Weekly wish you health and safety in the midst of this pandemic, and may we all come out stronger and better out of this.
No, the same to you. Avoid those bugs.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, thank you.